Hello everyone. Imagine you are standing in a quiet, ruined corner of a German village in April 1945. The smoke from a recent skirmish is still heavy, but the only sound is the distant rumble of tanks. You are walking toward a small temporary cemetery. Just a few mounds of fresh dirt marked with wooden crosses made from crate slats. These are the graves of your friends, the boys who didn't make it past the last hedgerow. But as you get closer, you see something that makes your blood turn to ice. A group of captured Nazi soldiers are standing over one of the graves. They aren't mourning. They are laughing. They have kicked over the wooden cross, and one of them is using a shovel to carelessly toss dirt aside, looking for boots or a ring to steal from a man who can no longer fight back. To them, it is just a hole in the ground. To you, it is a crime against humanity. Now imagine the sound of a horn, a loud, piercing blast that cuts through their laughter like a blade. A dusty jeep screeches to a halt, and before the tires even stop spinning, a man with stars on his shoulders and fire in his eyes steps out. That man is General George S. Patton, and in the next 10 minutes, those Nazis are going to learn that while they may have survived the battle, they have just provoked a man who considers the dead his personal responsibility. If you believe that the resting place of a hero is holy ground, type the word honor in the comments right now. And if you want to see the moments where history stopped being a textbook and started being a battle for the soul, hit that subscribe button and stick with us. We don't just tell stories here. We look at the moments where men became legends. To truly understand the absolute rage that was about to unfold, we have to pause and look at what a temporary grave actually meant in 1945. These weren't the beautifully manicured lawns of Arlington. When a soldier fell in combat, his unit didn't have the luxury of stopping the war to hold a beautiful ceremony. They had to keep moving. The graves registration units would follow behind the front lines, doing the heartbreaking work of identifying the fallen. They would take one of the soldiers' 2 dog tags, leaving the other with the body. They would dig a quick, shallow grave, place a crude wooden cross made from whatever scrap wood they could find, and hang that metal dog tag on it. That cross and that piece of stamped metal were the only things standing between a hero's legacy and total oblivion. It was a placeholder for a grieving mother in Ohio, a widow in Brooklyn, or a father in Texas. Every American soldier knew that if they went down, that crude wooden cross would be their only monument until the war was won. Now look at the men guarding those prisoners. The American GIs standing in that village were barely 20 years old, but their eyes looked like they belonged to old men. They had survived the freezing nightmares of the winter, fought through towns they couldn't even pronounce, and watched the men they trained with disappear in an instant. They were exhausted down to their very bones when they saw those captured SS soldiers kicking over the cross of a fallen American and digging into the dirt like scavengers. Every single instinct in those young GIs screamed at them to raise their rifles and end it. The anger wasn't just political, it was profoundly personal, but they didn't shoot. They stood their ground, gripping their weapons so tightly their knuckles turned white. Why? Because of discipline. Because they were American soldiers who operated under a code of conduct. They held their fire, waiting for an officer to handle the situation. But they weren't waiting for just any officer. They were waiting for a reckoning. On the other side of this psychological standoff were the captured Nazis. You have to understand the mind of an SS soldier in April 1945. According to historical analyses of the late war German military, these men knew the war was lost. Their cities were crumbling, their leadership was hiding, and their grand empire was turning to ash. But instead of surrender, their ideology had mutated into a toxic, nihilistic arrogance. If they couldn't win the war, they wanted to drag the dignity of their enemies down into the mud with them. The young Nazi holding the shovel wasn't digging just to find a pair of boots or a watch. He was digging to make a point. He was looking at the American guards, flashing a smirk, daring them to violate their own rules of engagement. He felt completely untouchable. He knew the Americans followed the Geneva Convention, which meant as a prisoner of war he was safe from being shot in cold blood. He believed he had found a loophole in the system, a way to spit in the face of his conquerors without facing any real consequences. He thought the Americans were soft because they showed restraint. He mistook their discipline for weakness. And then George S. Patton arrived. When Patton stepped out of his jeep, the entire gravity of the village shifted. Patton was not a man who commanded from a comfortable desk in London or Paris. He lived on the front lines, breathing the same dust and smelling the same gunpowder as his lowest-ranking privates. According to his own diaries and the accounts of his staff, Patton possessed a worldview that was entirely unique among the Allied high command. He didn't just study military history. He believed he was a part of it. He believed in reincarnation. He wrote poetry about fighting alongside Alexander the Great, marching with the Roman legions, and riding with Napoleon's cavalry. To General Patton, war was an eternal cycle, and the soldiers who fought in it belonged to a sacred, timeless brotherhood. Therefore, when Patton looked at an American GI, he didn't just see a draftee from the Midwest. He saw a modern-day legionnaire. He believed that when a soldier died in combat, he didn't just disappear. He transitioned into a higher echelon of honor. To Patton, the dead were not gone. They were watching. They were judging the living. So, when he laid his eyes on that group of laughing Nazis desecrating an American grave, he didn't view it as a mere violation of camp rules. He viewed it as a direct, unforgivable insult to the ancient code of the warrior. It was a spiritual assault on the very concept of honor. The silence that fell over that graveyard was suffocating. Patton didn't run toward the prisoners. He didn't wave his arms, and he didn't shout. According to the veterans who served under him, Patton's silence was always infinitely more terrifying than his legendary temper tantrums. When Patton yelled, you knew what he wanted. When Patton went completely quiet, you knew someone was about to be destroyed. He walked toward the desecrated grave with a slow, deliberate stride. Every crunch of his polished boots on the gravel sounded like a countdown. As he approached, the laughter of the Nazis died in their throats. The young soldier holding the shovel froze. They didn't need to speak English to understand what was happening. They saw the 3 stars gleaming on Patton's polished helmet. They saw the famous ivory-handled revolvers resting on his hips. But most importantly, they looked into his eyes. There was no political diplomacy in Patton's stare. There was no hesitation. There was only the cold, calculating look of an apex predator who had just caught a thief in his home. Patton stopped right at the edge of the disturbed dirt. He looked down at the wooden cross that had been carelessly kicked aside. He looked at the dog tag lying in the mud. Then he slowly raised his head and locked eyes with the arrogant Nazi holding the shovel. The young German tried to maintain his smirk. He tried to stand tall, clinging to the last pathetic shreds of his master race indoctrination. He was waiting for Patton to scream. He was waiting for Patton to pull his gun, fully prepared to play the role of the defiant martyr. But Patton denied him that satisfaction. He leaned forward, his face just inches from the Nazi, and he spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. It was a low, vibrating growl that carried a weight heavier than any artillery shell. Patton told him that in all the wars he had fought, across all the centuries of human conflict, the one universal truth was that cowards always reveal themselves when they face the dead. He told the young Nazi that a real soldier fights men who can fight back, but only a parasite digs into the pockets of a corpse. He made it crystal clear that they were not prisoners of war in his eyes. They were scavengers, and scavengers do not get treated with the respect of soldiers. This is the exact moment where Patton's genius for psychological warfare took over. A lesser commander would have ordered the American guards to beat the prisoners. A crueler commander might have ordered a firing squad on the spot, citing an attempt to escape. But Patton knew that physical pain fades. Bruises heal and death is an instant release. Patton wanted a punishment that would shatter their ideology, crush their arrogance, and haunt them for the rest of their natural lives. He stood up straight, turned to his junior officers, and issued a command that completely caught everyone off guard. He didn't order the Nazis into holding cells. He ordered them to drop their remaining gear. He pointed at the shovels. And then he pointed at an empty, flat stretch of land just outside the village. Patton declared that since these men loved digging in American graves so much, he was going to give them an opportunity to dig until their hands bled. But he wasn't going to make them just fix the one grave they had ruined. According to the accounts of the Third Army's disciplinary actions, Patton ordered his men to go into the surrounding village and round up every single captured German soldier, SS officer, and even the local civilian collaborators who had supported them. He brought them all to the edge of the field. He told them that the temporary graves scattered around the hedgerows were no longer suitable. He ordered the Nazis to build a proper permanent cemetery for the American fallen. He ordered them to dig over 100 new graves. They had to be perfectly aligned, perfectly deep, and completely uniform. And they had to do it by hand. No heavy machinery. No assistance from the American troops, just shovels, picks, and the cold, unyielding German soil. The labor began immediately. Patton stood there, his shadow stretching across the field as the afternoon wore on. He didn't go back to his command post. He didn't sit down. He stood like a statue, watching every single movement. The Nazis, who had prided themselves on never doing manual labor, were suddenly forced into the most agonizing physical exertion of their lives. The ground was hard, filled with rocks and roots. Within the first hour, their hands began to blister and bleed. Their backs ached. The arrogant young soldier who had been laughing earlier was now panting, covered in sweat and dirt, his hands raw and shaking. Every time a German soldier stopped to catch his breath, or every time a shovel hit a rock and a man hesitated, Patton's voice would crack through the air. He didn't let them rest for a single second. He reminded them constantly of the wooden cross they had kicked over. He told them that they were building a Cathedral of Honor, and that their sweat was the only acceptable payment for the disrespect they had shown. Once the graves were perfectly dug, the punishment shifted from physical exhaustion to profound psychological humiliation. Patton ordered the Nazis to move the bodies of the fallen American GIs from their temporary resting places to the new cemetery. He forced them to handle the caskets with absolute precision and extreme care. If a casket was jostled, or if it wasn't lowered into the ground with perfect respect, Patton made them pull it back up and do it again. He was forcing the very men who had caused these deaths to become the caretakers of the victims. He was forcing them to recognize the humanity, the weight, and the reality of the people they had tried to erase from the earth. But Patton was not finished. The physical labor was just the setup. The true execution was mental. As the sun began to set, casting a deep orange glow over the newly formed cemetery, Patton ordered every single German prisoner to form a perfect military formation at the edge of the graves. He made them stand at rigid attention. Their muscles were screaming in pain, their hands were trembling, but they did not dare move. Patton ordered his American officers to step forward with the American flag. He commanded the Nazis to perform a full, formal military funeral service for the boys they had mocked. He made the highest-ranking SS officers lead the procession. As the American flag was slowly raised on a makeshift flagpole, Patton gave the order that broke their spirits completely. He ordered the Nazis to salute. Not their twisted party salute, but a traditional, honorable military salute to the flag of the United States. Imagine the absolute devastation of their worldview in that moment. The master race, the men who had been brainwashed since childhood to believe they were the supreme rulers of the earth, were now standing in the mud, covered in dirt, their arms raised in forced reverence to the symbol of their conquerors. They were forced to stand completely silent, while an American bugler stepped forward and played the haunting notes of taps. The sound of the bugle echoed through the ruined village, bouncing off the destroyed buildings. A final beautiful goodbye to the boys who had given everything. Patton made the Nazis hold that salute for the entirety of the ceremony. If a man's arm wavered from exhaustion, an American GI would step forward, and the threat was silently communicated. They held their salute, and they were forced to look at the wooden crosses they had just planted. They were forced to read the names. They were forced to realize that their entire ideology had been defeated not just by superior firepower, but by a superior moral code. When the ceremony finally ended and darkness fell over the village, Patton did not send the prisoners back to the relative comfort of a holding pen. He ordered them to stand guard around the perimeter of the cemetery for the rest of the night. He walked down the line, looking each man in the eye, and told them that if a single wild animal disturbed the dirt, if a single leaf fell and wasn't picked up, or if anyone dared to speak a word of disrespect, they would answer to him personally at sunrise. He turned the desecrators into the ultimate protectors. He took men who wanted to be wolves and turned them into watchdogs for the American dead. This masterclass in psychological dominance did exactly what Patton intended. The story of what happened in that village spread through the German prisoner ranks like wildfire. It sent a very clear message. The Americans might follow the rules of war, but if you cross the line into desecration, you will face a wrath that you cannot even comprehend. It destroyed the lingering arrogance of the SS in that sector. They realized that their psychological games were completely useless against a commander who refused to be intimidated. But the most profound impact was on the American troops themselves. You have to put yourself in the boots of those young GIs who had been holding their rifles back at the beginning of the day. They had watched their general, a man with 3 stars, a man who commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, stop everything he was doing to defend the honor of a single, nameless private. They saw that their sacrifices actually meant something. They saw that if they fell in battle, they wouldn't just be forgotten numbers on a casualty report. Their commander would personally ensure that the entire world respected their memory. It was an injection of pure, unadulterated morale. It validated every cold night, every moment of terror, and every drop of blood they had given. We look back at this story today not just as an interesting footnote of World War II, but as a defining lesson in the nature of respect and leadership. It is incredibly easy to respect a hero when they are standing in front of you, covered in medals. But true honor, the kind of honor that defines a nation, is how you treat those who can no longer defend themselves. Patton was a highly controversial figure. He was flawed, he was loud, and he made mistakes. But his devotion to the sanctity of the American soldier was absolute and unbreakable. He understood that you cannot defeat an evil ideology just by shooting at it. You have to humiliate it. You have to expose its cowardice. By forcing the Nazis to dig those graves and salute that flag, Patton didn't just punish a crime. He permanently corrected the moral balance of the universe in that small patch of dirt. He proved that dignity is not something the enemy can take from you, as long as there is someone left who is willing to demand it. If you believe that General George S. Patton's method of psychological justice was the ultimate way to handle those who disrespect the fallen, I want you to type the word justice in the comments right now. Think about it. Would you have had the immense patience and tactical genius to break their minds the way Patton did? Or would your anger have taken over in the moment? Let us know your thoughts below. Thank you for joining us today as we uncovered one of the most powerful, raw, and human moments of wartime history. These are the untold stories that remind us of the incredible price of the freedoms we enjoy today. If you want to keep exploring the heart, the soul, and the gritty reality of the leaders and soldiers who shaped our world, please make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on your notifications. Your support is the only reason we can keep digging into the archives to bring these legends back to life. We have many more intense, deeply human stories from the front lines coming your way, and we don't want you to miss a single second. Stay curious, stay honorable, and always remember the names on the crosses. We will see you in the next video. Stay strong.